Assignment 4, Part 1. Jewish Identity and Jewish Community in the Modern World. As you read through the materials, have in mind the question which you will answer for your assignment. In your opinion, were the changes brought about by modernity to the way in which Jewish people identified with their communities a positive or negative thing? Introduction. This article will examine 4 questions. 1. How did the relationships between different Jewish centres change as a result of modernity? 2. What happened to the identity of Jews in the modern world, and how did this affect their relationship to the community? 3. How did the structure of the Jewish community change after modernity? 4. How did the relationship between Eretz Yisrael and the diaspora change as a result of modernity? As you read through this article, remember to keep in mind that change and modernity affected different areas of the Jewish world at different times and at different paces. The changing relationship between Jewish centres in the modern world. Generally, in the pre-modern world, Jews in one place saw Jews in another place as members of the same people. They believed strongly in the rabbinic guideline that all Jews are responsible for one another. But this feeling of solidarity began to disappear in the modern world. From the late 18th and 19th centuries, many modern Jews in the West began to feel much closer to their non-Jewish neighbours, and did everything that they could to promote this closeness. As their attachment to their non-Jewish neighbours increased, their attachment to their fellow Jews from other lands decreased. Many started to define themselves as members of the Jewish religion, rather than as members of the Jewish nation. They were French or German by nationality now, so how could they also be members of a Jewish nation? When they downplayed their nationality, they also downplayed their connection with Jews in other countries. Loyalties had shifted. Let us hear from Simon, a German Jew living in the middle of the 19th century.
I have heard about the problems of the Jews in Morocco. I know it can't be easy for them, but if I were asked to help them, I don't think that I would. Don't think of me as a heartless person, and don't think of me as a bad Jew, but I have to say that I feel nothing for the Jew in Africa. Historically, we once belonged to the same nation. His ancestors and my ancestors both came out of Egypt, but that was thousands of years ago. What possible connection do I, a German citizen of the modern West, have with an Arab-speaking Jew of North Africa? We live in totally different worlds. What possible connection could there be? I have a great deal in common with other Germans. We speak the same language and share the same culture. I can talk to my German neighbours about the things that are important to me, art, literature, and politics. But what could I talk about with a Jew from Morocco? Even though I'm always sorry to hear of the trials and problems of Jews in other places, I cannot feel that I am connected to them in any deep way.
Simon's position characterises the position of some Western Jews up until today. However, many Jews changed their attitudes over time. In the late 19th century, a series of terrible outbreaks of anti-Semitism had the effect of prodding some Western Jews into action. The feeling of being part of the same nation had gone, but the feeling of responsibility had not disappeared altogether. One of the first Jews to respond in this way was a wealthy English Jew, Moses Montefiore. Montefiore, a religious man, was deeply affected by events in Damascus in 1840. I heard this terrible story of Jews getting blamed for the disappearance of some Christian monks from their monastery in Damascus, Syria. Jews were tortured until they confessed, and one of them died in the process. I was outraged. I thought that these kinds of false accusations had stopped centuries ago. I got in touch with some of the leading Jews in France, and we started to make a huge fuss about the story. We went out to the Middle East to talk to the Syrian Sultan, and to get those poor Jews out of trouble. The whole episode made me realize that we Jews in the West are extremely lucky. I have had the fortune of being born into the British Empire, the greatest empire in the world, and serving my great Queen Victoria. Jews like the Jews in Damascus were not as fortunate. Their situation is much less comfortable, but through no fault of their own. I therefore made up my mind to do whatever I could, as a proud English Jew, to help Jews throughout the world, wherever they needed help. Montefiore's actions, and the publicity that he and his French colleagues created about the Damascus episode, persuaded many Jews of the West that they could not abandon their responsibility to other Jews around the world. But it is worth noticing Montefiore's phrase describing himself as an English Jew. He saw himself as a proud citizen of England. Other Jews around the world did not belong to the English nation, but they did still belong to the same religion, and this was why he felt a duty to help them. The horrors of the Shoah and the rise of the State of Israel have actually increased this feeling of worldwide Jewish solidarity. Many Jews today feel extremely connected to Jews in other places, not perhaps as one single nation, but as part of something larger, a people. The changing identity of Jews in the modern world. We saw in Assignment 3 that the Haskalah, Jewish Enlightenment, of the 18th and 19th centuries in Western Europe had major effects on the ways that Jews identified themselves. Many Jews stopped identifying themselves according to traditional halachic criteria. New streams of Judaism developed, such as Reform Judaism, which believed in a theological but non-halachic Judaism; Conservative Judaism, as it came to be called, which believed in a changing and evolving halacha; Modern Orthodox Judaism, which believed in a traditional halachic Judaism but combined with involvement in the modern world. In addition, there were Jews who abandoned Judaism altogether, and Jews who still identified themselves as Jewish but did not want any involvement with the Jewish community. What allowed Jews to redefine themselves and to belong to different types of Jewish groups, or to no group at all? To answer this question, we must first examine Jewish identity before modernity, and the way in which the outside world understood Jewish identity before modernity. Jews were seen as belonging legally to a collective Jewish group. Societies related to Jews not as individuals, but as part of a collective. The Jewish collective, with its own leadership, was responsible for regulating Jewish life in a number of areas, for example, collecting taxes. The collective had its own laws and methods of law enforcement. It also had its own leadership, which could make demands on every Jewish individual. Let us look at parts of the constitution of the tiny community of Sugenheim in the area of Bavaria, Germany, from 1756. Synagogue will be held on Mondays and Thursdays. Anyone who does not come to synagogue on these days to hear the Torah reading, and who remains at home instead, must pay a fine of 1 krusa to the Jewish treasury. The punishment if one does not come to synagogue on the minor day of atonement. If a member of the community does not come to the synagogue on the minor day of atonement, the day before Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, and is unable to prove that he had duties which could not be delayed, he shall either be fined a quarter of a pound of wax, or he shall not be called up to the Torah reading for a month. The cantor, prayer leader, shall call people to the synagogue regularly. Whenever there is to be a religious service, the cantor shall call people to the synagogue so that no one can say that they did not know about it. If the cantor forgets, he is to be fined 10 kruza the first time, and if he forgets often, he is to be fined 15 to 20 kruza, or maybe even dismissed. penalty for fighting in the synagogue. He who fights with another person in the synagogue and acts shamefully must pay a fine of 20 krusa, half goes to the state authorities, and the other half to the Jewish communal treasury. Things changed dramatically with the transition to modernity. Societies started to relate to Jews as individual citizens. They were no longer all part of a collective, which could impose control with the authority of the state. Each Jew now became an individual and direct member of the outside society. They could belong to the Jewish community, but this was an individual decision. The Jewish community no longer had power over its members. As a result, individual Jews could now pick and choose their own Jewish identity. There had certainly been variations between different types of Jews up until now, but they were all variations on a certain basic model of Jew who accepted the way of life developed by the rabbis. Previously, if Jews had refused to accept this way of life, this would have meant removing themselves from the Jewish collective and probably converting to Christianity or Islam. But now, it was possible to move away from the traditional rabbinic way of life and still remain a Jew. Jews could now define themselves in a much wider variety of ways. There was another factor responsible for opening up the ways that Jews defined themselves. Science and technology were advancing very quickly and able to explain more and more of the world's secrets. If science and technology could explain the mysterious things that used to be explained by resort to God, many people, including many Jews, felt that there was no longer any need for God. If God was no longer in the picture for many Jews, then their Jewish identities were likely to become more flexible and less religious. The Jew was living in two worlds, with one foot in the old Jewish world and one foot in the new outer world. For many Jews at this time, the outer world, the world that had been denied to them for so many centuries, would prove to be the more attractive one. That's the end of assignment 4, part 1.